Welcome back. In this part, we start getting into the nitty-gritty details of Linux. We start to configure services, configure file permissions, add users and group, remove users, and edit a lot of things. But don't worry, it's not as complicated as it sounds. It really is pretty straightforward. By the end of this section, you'll see what I'm talking about. The first section in this part is about basic networking. In this section, we're going to cover an understanding of basic networking, such as finding network information like maybe your IP address, your DNS address, your gateway, also identifying running services on your machine that's communicating on the network. Here's a post-exploitation tip for you. After you compromise the Linux host, one of the things that you want to be looking at is whether it has two network interfaces. If it does, that usually means it's connected to two different networks, and you can use that compromised host to make your way into another network or another network segment. In corporate environments, this is a common practice. When you want to separate two networks that host sensitive information and sensitive servers. Other information you want to look at is what DNS server the compromised host is communicating with. Also, what gateway is it communicating through? That gives you a much better understanding about the network you're on. So when it comes to network connectivity, there are a few things that we want to be looking at. Network interfaces is one. Am I on a wired network? Am I on a wireless network? Am I on a VPN? What's my IP address? What is my gateway? What route is my traffic following? All of this information you need to ascertain once you land on a new host. In Linux, the naming convention for network interfaces is as such. If it's a wired network, and by the way, if I'm saying network interfaces and you're not familiar with that, it is how your computer is connected to the network. So imagine if your computer is plugged into a network cable. I'm talking about a physical network cable here. The hardware your network cable is plugged in is called the network card. And the network card has an interface that would have an IP address. The same thing happens on Wi-Fi. So your Wi-Fi adapter or your Wi-Fi network card will have its own interface with its IP address. Now, if you are on a wired network, the name for this interface is ETH0. ETH stands for Ethernet. This means that you are on a wired network. If you have one card or one network card, it will be ETH0. If you have another network card, it will be ETH1, ETH2, and so on. In recent years, some Linux versions have been moving away from the ETH naming convention to something else, such as EN or ENS, or some other variation depending on what Linux distribution you're using. So if instead of ETH0 you see something like ENS33, don't be surprised, that's just the new naming convention. If you are on a wireless network, it would be WLAN0, so wireless LAN. And lastly, the LO stands for the loopback address, also known as home, also known as localhost. And the loopback address has the IP address of 127.0.0.1. This is always the IP address for your localhost or for your home or for the loopback address. So if you try to ping 127.0.0.1, you'll always get a response because you are pinging your own computer. Let's see how these things practically look like. In Linux, if I want to find out what my IP address is, the command to use is IPA. It used to be ifconfig, which is now considered to be deprecated. It still works, ifconfig still works, and you will see a lot of resources referring to it online, so it's important for you to know about it just in case you come across it. And you can still use it. Like I mentioned, it still works, but I do suggest that you start getting used to the newer commands, so go with IPA instead. I'll be the first to admit it took me a while to transition into the new version of IPA because I've been using ifconfig for more than 10 years. So I was a little bit resistant to change, but I finally accepted it and now I use IPA. And as you can see here, it returns my IP address. If I want to find out what my DNS server is, the command to do that would be nslookup followed by any website, say like Hackers Academy. And the command returns an output telling me that this IP address is that of my DNS. This is the DNS that I'm using when I'm trying to communicate with external IP addresses. By the way, if you're not familiar with what DNS is, a DNS server is a server that my computer asks for IP addresses of other computers or other servers. For example, if I want to visit google.com or hackersacademy.com, my computer needs to know its IP address. So it will ask a DNS server to provide it with this IP. And the DNS lookup command tells me what that DNS server is. Again, here, NSLookup is also considered to be deprecated in some circles, and there are alternatives to it like dig and host. They all do pretty much the exact same thing. Another way to find your DNS server is to look into a file called resolve.conf. We can use the cat command to look at the contents of the file, and the file you can find it under /etc/resolve.conf. And here we go. That's the DNS server that we're using. Now, of course, I'm sitting on an internal network, on a private network. And for my traffic to go out to the internet to be able to communicate with other websites, let's say, it needs to go through a gateway. And to find out the gateway that my packets or my traffic is going through, I type IP route. And it just happens in this case that my gateway is the same as my DNS server. I can actually verify this, and I can use the traceroute command. Traceroute shows me the exact path that my packets or traffic will take from my computer to reach any other destination. And if our assumption is right, our traffic should go through the gateway. I'm going to go traceroute hackersacademy.com, and I will kill this quickly with Ctrl+C. And as you can see, the gateway, which is the first hop here, the first IP address, this is the IP address that we saw earlier, and this is the IP address of my gateway. Here's another post-exploitation tip for you. After compromising a host, you want to see what services are running on this host, and what other computers or hosts on the network are communicating with these services. You can do that using the netstat command. Usually you would do this with a few more options to make the output a little bit prettier, a little bit easier to understand. I like to use it with the option of ANTP. A stands for all, so it shows me all the running services and the numeric addresses. T shows me the TCP services, so T stands for the TCP protocol. P shows me the name of the running service, and N shows me the numeric value of the port that the protocol is communicating with. So instead of showing me HTTPS, it will show me 443. Of course, it's up to you what options you prefer. Play around with it and see how the output differs. By the way, netstat is yet another tool that is also considered to be deprecated, and the new alternative is SS. So give that a try, SS or SS-ANTP or SS-ATP. Again, if you're wondering why am I telling you about the tools that are deprecated and then I'm telling you about the newer tools, it's because it's important for you to know both. If you are reading an article online, or if you are watching a video online and they mention these tools, and they will mention these tools because they have been around for tens of years, in that case, I don't want you to get confused and be wondering, what is this tool? What does it do? Alright, so now you know about all of these tools. Play around with them a little bit, and when you're ready, let's move on to the next section.